Derek Hale couldn't remember the last time Allison had looked at him the way she used to, with warmth and genuine affection. Lately, her gaze was cold, distant, and evasive, as if she were always somewhere else entirely. He sat at the kitchen table that evening, staring into his coffee, wondering how everything had unraveled so quickly. The change had started about 2 months ago when they decided to rent out the guest house on their property. It was a decent structure, 1 bedroom, a small kitchenette, and a porch overlooking the woods. It had been sitting empty for years, so when a man named Victor Reyes answered their online listing, it seemed like a win-win. Victor had been polite, quiet, and paid his rent on time. For a while, Derek was convinced they'd found the perfect tenant. But then Allison started acting strangely. She became withdrawn, spending long hours outside with vague excuses about needing space. Derek would wake up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. When he finally confronted her, she claimed she just needed fresh air to clear her head. Derek tried to believe her. He told himself that it was just stress. Maybe work or finances were weighing on her. But deep down, a gnawing suspicion began to take root. It wasn't long before he noticed a pattern. Whenever Allison disappeared late at night, she would head toward the guest house. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the signs were impossible to ignore. The way she always seemed anxious around him now. The secretive texts she would quickly hide when he walked into the room. The laughter he overheard one evening, soft and intimate, from the direction of the guest house. Derek's jaw clenched at the memory. He had tried to convince himself it was nothing, that maybe Allison was just being friendly with Victor. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, the suspicion wouldn't go away. Was she having an affair? One night, Derek decided he couldn't live in uncertainty any longer. He waited until Allison was asleep, then slipped out of bed quietly. He put on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the cool night air. The yard was shrouded in shadows, the moon casting faint silver light across the grass. The guest house loomed at the far end of the property, its windows dark and lifeless. Derek approached cautiously, careful to avoid the patches of gravel that might crunch underfoot. He positioned himself behind a cluster of trees and watched the house, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Derek's breath formed faint clouds in the chilly air as he kept vigil. He was about to give up and head back when he saw a figure emerge from the main house. It was Allison. She moved swiftly, glancing around nervously as she made her way to the guest house. Derek's stomach churned. He ducked lower behind the trees, his pulse racing. Allison knocked lightly on the door, and a moment later, it opened just enough for her to slip inside. Derek's thoughts spiraled. He had been right. Something was happening between Allison and Victor. He stayed hidden, determined to catch them in the act, but the minutes stretched into hours with no further movement. Finally, the door opened again, and Allison stepped outside, looking tense and distracted. She hurried back to the main house without noticing Derek's presence. Victor didn't follow her out. Derek waited, expecting the man to emerge at any moment, but the guest house remained eerily silent. Frustrated and confused, Derek finally retreated to the house. He lay awake in bed, his mind racing. Why had Victor stayed inside? What was he hiding? The next morning, Derek made up his mind to confront Victor. He waited until Allison left for work before walking to the guest house. He knocked firmly on the door, but there was no answer. After a few moments he tried again, harder this time. "Victor? You in there?" he called out. Silence. Derek frowned. He walked around the side of the house, peering into the windows. The place was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, nothing. It was as if Victor had vanished overnight. A chill ran down Derek's spine. He went back to the front door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside, his footsteps echoing eerily in the vacant space. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Where the hell did you go?" Derek muttered to himself. He searched the house, but there were no signs of life. The bed was stripped bare, the kitchen cabinets were empty, and even the refrigerator had been unplugged. It was as if Victor had never been there at all. That evening, Derek confronted Allison as soon as she got home. "Victor's gone," he said bluntly. She froze in the doorway, her face pale. "What do you mean, gone?" "I went to the guest house. He's not there. The place is completely empty." Allison's eyes darted around nervously. "Maybe he moved out. You said he was quiet. Maybe he didn't want to make a big deal about it." Derek crossed his arms. "And he didn't tell us? Didn't even leave a note?" Allison swallowed hard. I don't know." Her reaction confirmed Derek's worst fears. She knew more than she was letting on. But before he could press her further, she abruptly changed the subject, claiming exhaustion from work. Derek let it go for the moment, but he knew something wasn't right. Allison was hiding something much bigger than an affair. And he intended to find out exactly what it was. The tension in the house thickened in the days following Victor's disappearance. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Every interaction with Allison now felt strained and laced with suspicion. She walked around like a tightly wound spring, flinching at small sounds and checking her phone obsessively. Derek tried to bring up Victor a few more times, but Allison would always deflect the conversation. Maybe he had an emergency, she said one evening as they sat in silence over dinner. "People don't always explain themselves." "Right," Derek replied, stabbing at his food. "But you'd think someone renting from us would at least have the decency to leave a message." Allison's hand trembled slightly as she set down her fork. "I don't know what you want me to say, Derek. He's gone. Let it go." Let it go! He couldn't. Not when her anxiety was practically screaming at him that something was wrong. Derek watched her closely, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way she kept glancing toward the window. Later that night, after Allison went to bed, Derek slipped out of the house and made his way to the guest house again. He needed answers. The guest house remained as lifeless as before, but Derek's gut told him there was something he missed. He walked through each room slowly, his flashlight sweeping over the walls and floor. Everything appeared normal at first, until he noticed a loose floorboard near the corner of the living room. Crouching down, Derek pried the board loose and found a small, leather-bound notebook hidden underneath. The cover was scuffed, and it smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. He flipped it open and skimmed through the pages. At first, the entries seemed innocuous, random notes, lists of tasks, but then he noticed a series of names, some underlined and marked with dates. One name appeared multiple times, Victor Reyes. Beneath it were words that sent a chill through Derek's spine. Wanted, federal warrant. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. He kept flipping and found sketches of what looked like routes and meeting points. One entry stood out in bold letters. Contact compromised. Must relocate by Friday. Derek's heart raced as he pieced it together. Victor wasn't just a tenant, he was on the run. This wasn't some ordinary disappearance. And from the way Allison had been acting, she knew more than she was letting on. Had she helped him leave? Worse, was she involved in whatever trouble Victor had brought to their doorstep? The next morning, Derek couldn't hold back any longer. He confronted Allison before she left for work. "Where did Victor go?" he demanded, holding up the notebook. Allison's eyes widened in shock. "Where did you get that?" "It was hidden in the guest house," Derek said coldly. "You've been sneaking around there at night. You knew something about him, didn't you?" Allison crossed her arms, her body language defensive. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it," Derek snapped. "Because right now, it looks like you've been covering for a fugitive. And you're acting like someone's after you." For a moment, Allison said nothing. Her gaze flicked toward the front window, as if expecting someone to appear outside. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "Victor wasn't who he said he was," she admitted quietly. I found out a few weeks ago. He told me he had enemies, dangerous people. He asked for my help and I—" "You helped him?" Derek interrupted, his voice rising. "Allison, do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've brought here?" I didn't know what else to do, she shot back. He said he was trying to get out, to leave that life behind. I thought I was helping him escape. Escape from what? Derek asked. Allison hesitated before answering. He was involved in smuggling. Money, weapons. I don't even know the full extent. But he told me there were people who wanted him dead. That's why he disappeared. He's hiding. Derek ran a hand through his hair, disbelief washing over him. Jesus, Allison. Do you realize how dangerous this is? If those people find out you were involved. I know, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've been scared out of my mind. I didn't want to drag you into this. Well, it's too late for that. Derek muttered. They'll come looking for him. And if they find out you helped him. Allison's face paled further. What do we do? Derek took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. They were in over their heads, but panicking wouldn't solve anything. First, we need to find out exactly who these people are, he said. And then, we're going to the police. We can't handle this on our own. Allison nodded reluctantly. Okay, but we have to be careful. Victor warned me that these people have connections. If they know we're talking to the cops. They won't, Derek said firmly. We'll play it smart. But even as he spoke, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. Whoever Victor had been running from, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And now, Derek and Allison were in the crosshairs. The tension between Derek and Allison was suffocating. Neither of them spoke much after their confrontation. Derek spent the day pacing the property, constantly looking over his shoulder. Every creak of the wind, every distant car engine, sent his nerves into overdrive. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Allison was no better. She stayed inside, glued to the windows as if expecting someone to arrive at any moment. Derek didn't blame her. They were both trapped in a nightmare they hadn't fully understood until now. By mid-afternoon, Derek decided they couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. He needed to know more about Victor's enemies. He pulled out the notebook again, scanning the entries for clues. One name appeared multiple times alongside mentions of shipments and disputes: Rafael Mendoza. Derek typed the name into his phone, searching for any connection to criminal activity. It didn't take long for articles to surface. Mendoza was a known figure in organized crime, operating out of South Florida. He was suspected of running an international smuggling ring, but law enforcement had never been able to pin him down. Damn it, Derek muttered under his breath. Victor had been involved with people who didn't just make threats, they followed through on them. He approached Allison, who was sitting tensely on the couch. Does the name Rafael Mendoza mean anything to you? He asked. Her eyes widened slightly. Victor mentioned him once. He said Mendoza was someone he couldn't cross. He was afraid Mendoza would send people after him. Well, it looks like Mendoza's not just a random criminal, Derek said. He's one of the biggest players in smuggling. If Victor was running from him, that explains why you've been so scared. Allison ran a hand through her hair, her fingers shaking. So what do we do now? If Mendoza knows Victor stayed here. Derek sighed heavily. We'll have to go to the police soon. But first I need to make sure there's nothing else on this property that could connect us to Victor. If his people find evidence, it's going to paint a target on our backs. Derek spent the next few hours searching the guest house and the surrounding property. He looked for anything Victor might have left behind, documents, hidden phones, anything that could tie them to Mendoza's network. The guest house still felt eerily empty, but Derek's instincts told him he wasn't finding everything. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed something unusual near the edge of the woods behind the guest house, a small patch of disturbed soil. Kneeling down, he brushed away the top layer of dirt and uncovered a locked metal box. He carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. Allison hovered nearby, watching nervously. Do you think Victor left that here? She asked. Probably, Derek said as he pried the lock open with a screwdriver. The lid creaked, revealing stacks of cash, a burner phone, and more handwritten notes. Derek flipped through the notes, his stomach tightening with each page. They detailed smuggling routes, coded messages, and names of contacts, some of whom were local. "This is bad," Derek muttered. "If Mendoza's people find this, they'll know Victor kept records here. We'll be seen as accomplices." Allison paled. "They'll come after us." "Exactly." Derek picked up the burner phone and turned it on. To his surprise, it still had a charge. The screen lit up with several missed calls and unread texts, all from an unknown number. One of the messages caught his attention. "Where are you? We're coming to finish this." Derek felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. Whoever had sent that message was likely already searching for Victor, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. Or whoever had been closest to him. That evening, Derek called Mia Langford, a private investigator he trusted from previous business dealings. He explained the situation in vague terms, omitting names but emphasizing the danger. "Sounds like you're in serious trouble," Mia said, her voice sharp with concern. "You're saying these people are tied to organized crime?" "Yeah," Derek confirmed. "And they might be coming after us because of someone we unknowingly helped." Mia was silent for a moment before replying. "Okay. Here's what we'll do. I'll contact some people I know in law enforcement, but we need to be careful. If these guys have connections, they'll hear about any moves we make. Stay low and keep your phones off for now. I'll be in touch soon." "Thanks, Mia. I owe you one," Derek said, hanging up. Allison sat across from him, anxiety etched into her features. "What did she say?" "She's going to help," Derek replied. "But we have to be cautious. No phones, no unnecessary trips into town. We can't risk being seen." Allison nodded, her eyes darting to the windows again. "I hate this," she whispered. "I just wanted to help him. I didn't know it would lead to this." Derek softened slightly. Despite his anger, he could see the guilt weighing heavily on her. "We'll get through this," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "We just have to be smart." But deep down, Derek knew the clock was ticking. Mendoza's people wouldn't wait forever. That night Derek struggled to sleep. Every noise outside the house made him jump. He kept a bat by the bed, listening for any signs of movement in the yard. At around 3 a.m. he heard it, a faint rustling near the guest house. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he got out of bed and grabbed the bat. He moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Allison. Peeking out the window, he saw the outline of a figure moving in the shadows near the guest house. "They're here," he whispered to himself. It had begun. Derek's breath caught as he watched the shadowy figure move near the guest house. He couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but the slow, deliberate way the person moved sent a chill down his spine. They weren't just wandering by. Whoever it was had a purpose. He quietly made his way to the front door, gripping the bat tightly. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but every instinct told him this was connected to Victor. Derek cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The figure disappeared around the side of the guest house, vanishing into the shadows. Derek debated his options. Should he confront them or call the police? But if he called now, they might leave before the authorities arrived, and he'd have no evidence of what they were doing. He decided to act. Carefully, he stepped outside, barefoot on the cold grass, and crept toward the guest house. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he hugged the wall. He strained to listen, catching faint murmurs on the other side of the building. More than one voice. Shit, he thought. There was more than one of them. Check inside. A low voice ordered. Derek flattened himself against the wall, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to distract them, maybe by some time. Just as he was about to move, he heard the door to the guest house creak open. Footsteps echoed inside. "We're not finding anything," another voice muttered. "Keep looking. He wouldn't just disappear without a trace." Derek clenched his jaw. They were looking for Victor, or more likely, for anything he might have left behind. The box. He had it, but if they knew he'd taken it, he and Allison were in even more danger than he thought. Derek crept back toward the main house, his mind racing with what to do next. As he reached the door, Allison appeared in the hallway, her face pale with fear. "Derek?" she whispered. "What's going on?" "There are people at the guest house," he replied quietly. "I think they're looking for Victor." Her eyes widened in terror. "Oh my God! What do we do?" "Stay calm," Derek said, though his voice was tight with tension. "We need to call the police. Lock the doors and stay away from the windows." Allison nodded and hurried to lock the front and back doors while Derek grabbed his phone. He called the local sheriff's office, keeping his voice low as he explained the situation. "We'll send deputies out," the dispatcher assured him. "Stay on the line if you can." Derek glanced toward the guest house, where a faint light flickered through one of the windows. He couldn't hear the intruders anymore, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. Minutes passed like hours as Derek and Allison waited in tense silence. The only sound was the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Derek kept his eyes on the yard, hoping to see the flash of patrol lights, but the woods remained dark. Finally, Allison whispered, "Do you think they'll come here?" "They might," Derek admitted. "But we're locked up. If they try anything, the deputies will catch them." As if on cue, they heard movement outside, a soft crunch of footsteps approaching the house. Derek stiffened, gripping the bat tighter. "Allison, get upstairs," he said urgently. "What about you?" "Just go," he insisted. "I'll handle this." Reluctantly, Allison retreated up the stairs. Derek stayed near the door, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, circling around to the side of the house. A shadow passed by the window, and Derek held his breath. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. Derek didn't move. The knock came again, harder this time. "We know you're in there," a voice called out. It was deep and menacing, with a slight accent Derek couldn't place. "We just want to talk." "Yeah, right," Derek muttered under his breath. The voice continued. "You're harboring something that doesn't belong to you. Give it to us, and we'll leave you and your wife alone." Derek remained silent. There was no way he was going to believe that lie. "All right," the man said after a pause. "Have it your way." A moment later, Derek heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. One of the windows had been broken. "Shit!" Derek hissed. He ran to the front door and peeked out. In the distance, he saw flashing red and blue lights. Finally, the deputies were arriving. "Get out of here!" Derek shouted, hoping to scare the intruders off. He heard hurried footsteps retreating toward the woods as the patrol cars pulled into the driveway. Deputies poured out of the vehicles, weapons drawn. "Sheriff's Department! Show yourselves!" one of them barked. Derek opened the door and waved them over. "They just ran into the woods," he called out. Two deputies chased after the fleeing suspects, while another approached Derek. "Are you and your wife okay?" "We're fine," Derek said, his adrenaline still surging. "They were searching the guest house. I think they were after something Victor left behind." "We'll secure the area," the deputy assured him. "Stay inside and lock your doors." Derek nodded, stepping back inside. Allison descended the stairs, her face pale and drawn. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Derek said grimly. "But they'll be back. We need to figure out our next move fast." As the deputies secured the perimeter, Derek knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Mendoza's men wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And if he and Allison didn't find a way to stay ahead of them, they might not survive the next encounter. The shattered window in the living room let in a cold breeze that seemed to match the chill running down Derek's spine. The deputies outside continued their search for the men who had fled into the woods, but Derek knew it wouldn't be enough to keep them safe long term. These people were relentless. Mendoza's name alone was enough to tell Derek that they wouldn't back down until they got what they came for. Allison paced nervously in the kitchen. "What if they come back with more people?" "Derek, they're not going to stop. What are we supposed to do?" "We can't stay here, that's for sure," Derek replied, his mind racing. We need to get somewhere safe, and fast. But first, I need to talk to the sheriff about what we found. You mean the box? Yeah. That box is what's tying us to this whole mess. If we hand it over to the authorities, it might give them a reason to protect us. Allison bit her lip, hesitating. And what if that just pisses Mendoza off more? What if he comes after us anyway? Then we fight, Derek said firmly. But sitting around waiting for them to attack isn't an option. A short while later, Derek and Allison sat in Sheriff Holden's office, recounting everything: Victor's disappearance, the box hidden on their property, and the men who had broken into their guest house. Holden listened intently, his brow furrowed as he examined the contents of the box. This is serious, Holden said, flipping through the notes. These documents could be key evidence in a federal investigation. If Mendoza's people know you have this, you're right. They're not going to stop. So what do we do? Derek asked. We'll need to contact the feds, Holden replied. This is out of our jurisdiction. In the meantime, I'll assign deputies to watch your property. But I recommend you and your wife go somewhere safe until we get a better handle on the situation. Derek nodded. That's what I was thinking. Good. And Derek, be careful, Holden warned. These people don't play by the rules. By that evening, Derek and Allison had packed essentials and left their house under the cover of darkness. Mia had arranged for them to stay at a remote cabin owned by a friend of hers, one that wasn't listed in any records. It was deep in the woods, far from town, and the perfect place to lay low. The drive was tense, neither of them speaking much. Derek kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them. But the road remained dark and empty. When they finally reached the cabin, Allison let out a shaky breath. This place is isolated, she muttered, glancing around nervously. That's the point, Derek said, stepping out of the car. The cabin was small but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and reinforced windows. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. They unpacked quickly and locked the doors behind them. Derek checked every room, making sure there were no other entry points. He felt a little better once everything was secured, but the weight of the situation still hung heavily over them. That night, Derek and Allison sat by the fireplace in tense silence. The flames crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. Derek finally broke the quiet. I still can't believe this is happening, he muttered. 1 minute we're just renting out the guest house, and now we're on the run from a criminal organization. Allison hugged her knees to her chest. It's my fault, she said quietly. I'm the one who got involved with Victor. If I'd just told you the truth from the beginning. Hey, Derek said, his voice softening. You didn't know it would turn into this. Yeah, you made a mistake. But right now, blaming yourself isn't going to help. We need to focus on surviving. She nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. Derek reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll get through this, he said. One step at a time. For a brief moment, the tension between them eased. But it didn't last long. A sudden noise outside snapped both of them to attention. It was faint, just a rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. Derek grabbed the bat he'd brought with him and motioned for Allison to stay put. Derek, wait, she whispered. I'm just going to check, he said, his voice low. Stay by the fire. He crept toward the front window and peered out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. But then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, he caught movement, a figure slipping between the trees. Damn it, Derek muttered. They'd been followed. He quickly locked all the doors and returned to Allison. We've got company, he said grimly. Her eyes widened. They found us? Looks like it. The phone Mia had given them buzzed, and Derek answered quickly. Mia, we've got a problem. Someone's outside the cabin. I figured they might find you, Mia said. Hold tight. I've got people en route to help, but you'll have to hold them off for a while. Great, Derek muttered, glancing toward the window again. We'll do what we can. He hung up and turned to Allison. We need to prepare. If they try to break in, we fight. Allison swallowed hard but nodded. Okay. Let's do it. The sound of footsteps outside grew louder. The hunt had begun once more. Derek moved swiftly, barricading the doors with whatever heavy furniture he could find. Allison helped, her hands trembling as she pushed a table against the back door. The cabin was small, with only 2 entrances, one in the front and another leading out to the small porch. If they could control those points, they might hold off whoever was out there long enough for help to arrive. The rustling outside intensified. It wasn't just one person anymore. There were multiple figures moving through the darkness, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. Derek glanced out the window but couldn't see anyone clearly. Shadows darted between the trees like ghosts. They're surrounding us, he muttered. Allison hugged herself, her face pale. How long until Mia's people get here? Soon, Derek said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. We just need to hold on. The phone buzzed again. Mia's voice was urgent when he answered. Derek, we're on our way. ETA 15 minutes. Whatever happens, stay inside and keep everything locked. 15 minutes might be too long, Derek said, glancing nervously at the window. They're closing in. Do whatever you have to, Mia replied. Just survive. Derek hung up and grabbed the bat. He wished he had a gun, something more substantial to defend them with, but the bat would have to do. He positioned himself near the front door, while Allison crouched behind the couch. Her wide eyes followed his every move. A loud bang shattered the tense quiet. Someone was pounding on the front door, hard enough to rattle the frame. Open up! A voice shouted. It was deep, commanding, with an accent Derek couldn't quite place. Not gonna happen, Derek muttered under his breath. The pounding continued, more aggressive this time. Then came another sound, glass breaking. Derek spun toward the window just in time to see a man's arm reach through the broken pane, trying to unlock it. Without thinking, Derek charged forward and swung the bat. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man yelped in pain, pulling his arm back. Stay the hell away! Derek shouted. There was a brief lull, and then a second voice called out. We don't want to hurt you. Just give us what we came for, and this can end peacefully. Derek scoffed. Yeah, I've heard that one before. You're not getting anything. The response was immediate. Another window shattered at the back of the cabin, followed by the sound of boots crunching across broken glass. They're inside! Allison cried. Stay low! Derek barked. He sprinted toward the back, where a tall, broad-shouldered man was climbing through the broken window. The man barely had time to react before Derek swung the bat, catching him in the ribs. The intruder stumbled, gasping in pain, but quickly recovered and lunged at Derek. They crashed into a bookshelf, toppling it to the floor. Derek fought wildly, swinging the bat again and again until he managed to knock the man off balance. The intruder fell to the ground, groaning, and Derek kicked him hard in the stomach. Allison! Derek shouted. We have to move, now! Allison scrambled to her feet and ran toward the front door. Derek followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear more footsteps outside, more voices shouting orders. They were outnumbered and running out of time. As they reached the door, Derek froze. Another figure stood silhouetted on the porch, blocking their exit. The man was holding a crowbar, his eyes glinting in the dim light. End of the line, the man sneered. Derek tightened his grip on the bat. You really want to do this? Before the man could respond, a sudden flash of red and blue lights illuminated the trees behind him. Sirens wailed, cutting through the tense silence. The man's expression shifted from smug to panicked. Cops! He hissed. Derek took the opportunity to charge forward, swinging the bat with all his strength. The man barely had time to react before the bat struck his arm, causing him to drop the crowbar. Derek shoved him off the porch, sending him tumbling into the dirt below. Go! Now! Derek yelled at Allison. They burst through the door, running toward the flashing lights. Deputies were swarming the property, guns drawn as they shouted commands at the intruders. Derek and Allison stumbled towards safety, their breaths ragged and frantic. "Get down!" a deputy ordered. Derek and Allison dropped to the ground as the deputies advanced, subduing the remaining men. The fight was over. Minutes later, Derek and Allison sat on the back of an ambulance, both of them trembling from adrenaline. Mia arrived shortly after, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You two all right?" she asked, crouching beside them. "Yeah," Derek panted. "Thanks to you. They caught most of the guys," Mia said. "But a couple of them got away. We'll keep you under protection until this is fully dealt with." Allison nodded, her eyes still wide with shock. "They were going to kill us if you hadn't shown up." "You're safe now," Mia assured her. "We'll make sure it stays that way." Derek exhaled slowly, the weight of fear finally beginning to lift. They had survived the siege, but he knew the danger wasn't entirely over. Mendoza's network was vast, and this fight wasn't finished yet. But for now, they were alive. And that was enough. Derek awoke the next morning to the sound of deputies patrolling the property. The cabin felt eerily quiet compared to the chaos of the night before. He lay in bed for a few moments, trying to process everything. They had survived the attack, but Mendoza's men wouldn't just give up after one failed attempt. Allison stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. "Morning," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Morning," Derek replied softly. "How are you holding up?" "Better, I think," she said after a moment. "But I keep hearing the glass breaking, thinking they're still out there." Derek nodded in understanding. "I know. It's hard to shake that feeling." They got up and dressed quickly, both of them on edge despite the increased security presence outside. Deputies were stationed at key points around the property, and Sheriff Holden had promised regular patrols to keep an eye out for any further threats. But Derek knew they couldn't rely on the authorities alone. Mendoza's men were resourceful, and he doubted they'd come back without a more calculated plan next time. Later that day, Mia arrived with new information. She pulled Derek aside while Allison stayed inside. "We've confirmed the identities of the men from last night," Mia said. "They were low-level enforcers working for Mendoza. That means Mendoza knows Victor was here." "Great," Derek muttered bitterly. "So now we're officially on his radar." Mia nodded grimly. "Yeah, but there's a silver lining. Victor's notes, especially the ones about smuggling routes and contact lists, are valuable to law enforcement. The feds are interested, and they're putting pressure on Mendoza's organization." "That's good news, I guess," Derek said. "But it doesn't stop them from coming after us in the meantime." "No, it doesn't," Mia agreed. "That's why I'm suggesting you and Allison move to a safer location. Somewhere off the grid." Derek frowned. "We're already in the middle of nowhere. How much more off the grid can we get?" "I have a friend who owns a remote property up north," Mia explained. "No phones, no internet, completely cut off. You could stay there until the situation stabilizes." Derek sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He hated the idea of running and hiding, but what other choice did they have? Mendoza's reach extended far beyond their small town. "All right," he said finally. "If it keeps us alive, we'll do it." That evening, Derek broke the news to Allison. She was reluctant at first, worried about leaving everything behind again, but ultimately she agreed. They packed light, bringing only essentials. Mia coordinated the move with the authorities, ensuring no one outside the law enforcement circle knew where they were going. The drive was long and tense. They traveled through winding mountain roads, the trees closing in on either side like a protective barrier. Derek kept checking the rearview mirror out of habit, but there were no signs of pursuit. Eventually, they arrived at the remote cabin Mia had mentioned. It was smaller than the first one but sturdy, with thick walls and only a single entrance. There was no electricity, only a wood stove and lanterns for light. It felt like stepping back in time, but Derek found the isolation comforting. "This'll do," he said, stepping inside and surveying the place. Allison set down their bags, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. At least it's quiet, she murmured. Yeah. Let's hope it stays that way. The first few days passed without incident. Derek and Allison settled into a routine, chopping wood, boiling water, and keeping watch for any signs of danger. The quiet gave them time to reflect, but it also amplified their anxieties. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Allison finally broke the silence. Do you think Victor's still alive? Derek considered the question. Maybe. If he was smart enough to run, he might have found a way to disappear for good. I hope so, she said quietly. I don't want anyone else getting hurt because of this. Derek reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We're going to be okay. Mia's working with the feds now. Once they put enough pressure on Mendoza, he'll have bigger problems than us. Allison nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. I just want this to end. So do I. Derek agreed. But until it does, we have to keep our guard up. The next day, Mia called via a satellite phone she had provided. Her voice crackled through the static, but the urgency in her tone was clear. Derek, we've got an update, she said. The feds are closing in on one of Mendoza's key smuggling hubs. It's going to draw his attention away from you for a while, but you still need to be careful. How long do you think we'll have to stay out here? Derek asked. Hard to say, Mia replied. Could be weeks, maybe longer. It depends on how fast they can dismantle Mendoza's network. All right. Thanks for the update. After hanging up, Derek relayed the news to Allison. It wasn't much, but it gave them a sliver of hope. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to relax slightly. That night, Derek lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted in the distance, and the wind rustled the trees gently. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't hear the ominous crunch of footsteps outside. Maybe, just maybe, they had bought themselves some peace. But Derek knew better than to fully trust that feeling. Mendoza's shadow still loomed over them, and the fight wasn't over yet. Days turned into a week of uneasy quiet. Derek and Allison continued their routine at the remote cabin, always alert for any sign of Mendoza's men. Though there were no direct threats, the tension never fully left them. The fear of what could happen next remained a constant presence, hanging over every conversation and every silent moment by the fire. One cold, misty morning, Derek was chopping wood when he noticed something out of place, a trail of footprints near the tree line. The prints were fresh, too fresh to have come from him or Allison. His pulse quickened. They weren't alone. Allison, he called, rushing inside the cabin. She appeared instantly, alarmed by his tone. What's wrong? Someone's been out there, Derek said, grabbing the satellite phone. I'm calling Mia. The phone rang several times before Mia answered, her voice calm but firm. Derek? We've got fresh tracks near the cabin, he said quickly. It looks like someone's been watching us. Mia swore under her breath. All right, listen. The feds have made progress dismantling Mendoza's operations, but he still has a few loyal men out there. They might have found you. We're mobilizing a team to get you out, but you need to stay put and defend yourselves if necessary. How long until backup arrives? 2 hours, maybe less, Mia replied. Can you hold out that long? We'll have to, Derek muttered before hanging up. He turned to Allison. We need to secure the cabin now. They could try to move in at any moment. Allison nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they reinforced the door and windows, just as they had done during the previous attack. This time, however, there was no guarantee help would arrive in time. The first sign of the enemy's approach came with a distant rustling, followed by the faint crack of a branch snapping. Derek peered through one of the windows and saw 3 men moving through the woods. They were armed and moving in coordinated formation, circling the cabin like wolves hunting prey. They're coming, Derek whispered to Allison. What do we do? She asked, fear creeping into her voice. We make them think we're more prepared than we are, Derek said. He grabbed the lanterns and placed them near the windows to create the illusion of more movement inside. He hoped it would make the attackers hesitate, unsure of how many people were defending the cabin. The strategy worked, at least for a moment. The men outside paused, their shapes blending with the trees as they assessed the situation. "Victor isn't here!" Derek shouted through the window. "Whatever you're looking for, you're wasting your time." Silence. Then, one of the men called out. "We don't need Victor. We just want the files he left behind. Hand them over, and we'll leave you in peace." Derek shook his head. "I've heard that lie before. You're not getting anything." The response was immediate. A gunshot rang out, shattering one of the lanterns by the window. Allison screamed, ducking behind the couch. Derek grabbed the bat and crouched low, his heart racing. "They're trying to scare us," he whispered to Allison. "Stay down." Another gunshot echoed through the forest, but this time it missed the cabin entirely. Derek realized they weren't aiming to kill, yet. They were trying to force him and Allison out into the open. "We're not going anywhere," Derek muttered under his breath. Time crawled as the standoff continued. The attackers began moving closer, their footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Derek's mind raced, searching for a way to stall them until help arrived. Then, an idea struck him. He grabbed the burner phone Victor had left behind and activated it. The men outside might not know that Victor was gone, and Derek could use that to his advantage. He dialed one of the numbers listed in the phone's call history. After a few rings, a deep voice answered in Spanish. "¿Dónde estás? Where are you?" Derek didn't respond directly. Instead, he held the phone near the window and let the man on the other end speak louder. He hoped the attackers outside would hear and assume Victor was still alive and communicating. The effect was immediate. The men froze, whispering among themselves. They clearly hadn't expected this. Derek pressed his advantage. "You hear that?" he shouted. "Victor's still got people watching. You want to play games, you'll end up on the wrong side of his friends." The attackers hesitated, their formation breaking slightly as doubt crept in. Derek could feel the tension shift. They were no longer in complete control. Just then, the distant sound of engines broke through the forest. Backup had arrived. Flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance, accompanied by the roar of multiple vehicles. The attackers panicked, firing a few scattered shots before retreating into the woods. Deputies and federal agents poured into the clearing, quickly securing the perimeter. "Derek!" a voice called. "It was Mia. We're here!" Derek shouted back, opening the door. Within minutes, the situation was under control. The remaining attackers were captured, and agents began sweeping the area for evidence. Mia approached Derek and Allison, her expression both relieved and impressed. "You held them off," she said. "Nicely done." "Barely," Derek muttered. "But yeah, we made it." By the time the sun rose, the immediate threat had passed. Mendoza's network was crumbling, and the men who had attacked the cabin were in custody. Derek and Allison could finally breathe again. As they packed their belongings, preparing to leave the cabin, Allison turned to Derek. "Do you think it's really over this time?" "I think it's close," Derek replied. "But either way, we're not running anymore. We faced them, and we survived." Allison smiled faintly. "Yeah. We did." They left the cabin together, stepping into the dawn of a new chapter in their lives. The shadows of fear and betrayal were finally beginning to lift. For the first time in weeks, they felt free.